So before I give the floor to Emmanuel, just I mean, there have been talks about how great the intellectual life is, how great the building is at PSE. There's something as a basic researcher that is also extremely important for us is the quality of the staff. And at PSE we have great quality staff. And I just wanted to thank for the organization of the conference, Anaël and Sylvain, who did a great job.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today at the place where I first started learning economics when it was the time, before PSU, but it's always a pleasure to be back and talk and work with people here. So today I'm going actually to present joint work with Thomas Piketty here and Gabriel Zuckman that we saw before, and that's giving you some details for the case of the United States of the new estimates that we've put together that we call distributional national accounts. So the idea, the motivation here is that there is a large disconnect between the study of inequality and macroeconomics. So as we all know, macroeconomics uses the concepts of national accounts that have been developed over the 20th century, but they don't provide any distributional information, while inequality analysis has traditionally relied on survey and tax data that provide disaggregation, but they are highly inconsistent with macro totals. That is, if you look at total income reported in survey data, it's typically going to be like 60% or 70% of national income. Similarly, if you use individual income tax data, you'll have only 70% or 75% of total income. Why is that? Because there are a number of income components that are true economic income. So think about imputed rent if you are a homeowner, or retained profits of corporations that you don't, if you are a shareholder that belong to you but that you don't get immediately. And this gap makes it hard to know how growth is distributed. Okay, and the growth numbers really dominate the public debate about how the economy is doing, but we are unable at the present time to say, if we hear that growth has been 2% last year, how that growth has been distributed across the distribution. How does growth of bottom 50%, next 40%, or top 10% adults compare to total growth? What part of the rise in inequality is due to changes in factor shares, labor versus capital, or changes, in concentration within each income component? And finally, how do taxes and government spending affect the distribution of growth from a really comprehensive perspective? So what we do here in this paper is we attempt to construct what we call distributional national accounts, DINA, and the goal is to construct a micro database of income, wealth, taxes, and transfers consistent with national accounts totals for the United States. So the database will look like a micro level. So each record is an individual, but when you do a summary, in Stata for a given variable, it's going to give you a number consistent with macroeconomic totals. Okay, so we are going to provide income inequality series covering 100% of national income, the broadest measure of income, growth statistics by quantile consistent with macroeconomic growth, and Lucas presented already some of them earlier, and a first assessment of total redistributive effects of government intervention when you combine both taxes and all transfers, which is something, we public economists always would have wanted to have, but didn't exist in a systematic way. So if you want, historically, you can see that as going back to Kuznets' original intent. Kuznets was one of the founders of national accounting, and he also did pioneering work on inequality, and he really saw the two being studied together. even though, you know, effectively, historically, that's not the direction inequality analysis has taken. And so we are going back with this intent, but with more and better data. And as you've seen from Luca's presentation and from the existence of the WID website, with such a methodology that will be comparable across countries in the same way that national accounting is comparable across country, we'll be able really to compare inequality across countries and produce inequality series at the global level once we have enough countries. Okay, so how do we do this? So I'm going to be light on methodology, but let me give you the basics. So we start in the United States and in other countries as well with public use samples of tax returns that are high quality and have existed since 1962 in the United States. Their key advantage is that they oversample top income earners. Those are the data we used with Thomas Piketty when we produced the fiscal income, top income share series. And then we are going to supplement this data with additional IRS data that's going to give us age and gender information that is not in the public use files, the labor split for couples, and various forms of fringe benefits, like health insurance benefits that are a form of compensation, big in the United States, but that is not part of taxable income. And for missing income, such as imputed rent of homeowners, pension funds, returns on pension funds, we are going to use supplementary data from surveys, so the Survey of Consumer Finance, which is the best wealth survey in the United States. And for a number of transfers from the government, they are going to be imputed using another survey, the current population survey, that tells you how those benefits are distributed across the population. And there will be also a ton of assumptions in the background. Perhaps the most important one here in terms of distribution of government spending. For public goods, pure public goods, think about national defense, because we don't really know how to assign the value, the spending of national defense to each individual. Will make a distributionally neutral assumption. So what I want to say here is that when we do this, we have to make a very large number of assumptions. We lay them out, but the idea is that we don't claim that our assumptions are the best one. They are a prototype, if you want, that users might be able to modify down the road. And so in this talk, I'm going to focus on two income concepts, but to discuss them, I have to introduce the top one, which is factor national income. That would be the sum of all labor and capital income that a person might receive. So we don't use that as a basic income concept because it has the problem that retirees will typically have very low labor income and capital income. So they don't work anymore, and perhaps they receive mostly, Social Security benefits. So series based on factor national income are going to be very sensitive to aging, the share of the elderly in the population. So that's why we move to what we call pre-tax national incomes that essentially starts from factor income and operates, the pension system, public and private. That it subtracts contributions for pensions and social insurance contributions for pensions, for public pensions, and it adds the corresponding benefits for pensions, but also disability and unemployment. So the idea there is that it smoothes out essentially the life cycle. That is, workers receive less because they pay contributions, but then the retirees have replacement income. And then the last concept that we will use is post-tax national incomes that subtracts all other taxes and adds back all other forms of government spending, individualized transfers, and public goods at all levels of government. So in the US, not only the federal level, but also the state and local level. The key point here is that those three concepts add up to the same national income concept. So it gives really the broadest view of the redistributive effects of the government. Once you take away all taxes, add back all government spending, and include also the government deficit, you are back to exactly the same aggregate definition. National income here, which I remind you is the broadest measure. You know, it's GDP, excluding depreciation of capital that is not really an income, and adding net foreign income. Okay? And so, as I discussed, you know, the final product that is still in the works, it's not publicly disclosed yet, but will soon will be annual micro data representative of the US population. And we want to have that micro data available online precisely so that users and researchers can compute their own inequality series. Here I'm going to show you a selection of those series, but they might not be exactly what you want for your own research project. So hopefully with this annual level data, so 50, 55 years of data, you can compute what you will need. So we complete that data for the first part of the 20th century, relying on tabulated tax statistics. So that's why many of the series I will show extend to all a century. Okay, so let me now go through the main results. So let me start with the distribution of US national income and growth pre-tax versus post-tax. So the first graph I want to show you, that's the share of total national income going to the top 10% adults in the population on a pre-tax basis in red, and on a post-tax basis in blue. The other thing I haven't said is that when I say per adult, how do we deal with couples? So in this baseline series, for a family, for a married family, income is split equally between both spouses. So that's the assumption we start with, but later on I can show you series where we split income based on how earnings are divided, you know, between the two married people. So what do we see here? It's the familiar big U-shape U-shape for those series. You can see that the pre-tax income was very high before World War II. 45 to 48% of total income going to the top 10%. Sharp drop after World War II. Low levels of pre-tax income concentration in the decades after World War II. And then in recent decades, a sharp increase, so that on a pre-tax basis, we are essentially back to the peak level that were experienced in the US before World War II. So those series are actually not, in the end, that different in shape from the series of fiscal income that we put together with Thomas Piketty, even though in reality the base here, you know, is much larger and covers full national income. So now the second series here in blue shows you income concentration on a post-tax basis. You subtract taxes and you add back all government transfers. So early on it's very similar because the government is small. Taxes are about 10-15% of national income. The key difference is really in the recent decades, where there is also a sharp increase in post-tax income concentration, but it's substantially less than pre-tax, because the key difference is that today, even in the US, the government is relatively large. It takes about 1/3 of national income in taxes and funds a number of programs, you know, in a way that's more progressive. Essentially, taxes are proportional to income, to a first approximation, while public spending is more, you know, a fixed amount per capita, to take a very broad view of what the government does, so that on a post-tax basis today, the level of income concentration is still substantially less than it was before World War II. Now, that's for the top 10%. Now, when you look at the bottom 50%, pre-tax in red again and post-tax in blue, you can see that on a post-tax basis, the bottom 50% gets more than on a pre-tax basis. That is, it benefits on average from government taxes and transfers. But you can see also that there is a sharp decline both pre-tax and post-tax in the share of total income it receives. And on a pre-tax basis, it's really dramatic. It falls from more than 20% to something like 12%. So the next thing I want to show you is really now combining growth and inequality, which is something you can really do on a solid basis with this data. So in black here, you have the evolution of national income per adult in the full economy. Okay, and so it goes from $30,000 in '62, that's controlling for inflation, up to $65,000 in 2014. And so from 1980, which is a key breaking point where inequality starts to increase, to 2014, you have 60% growth over that 34-year period. Now, if I just exclude the top 10%, I get the bottom 90%, and that's the series in white. And you can see that for the bottom 90%, the growth, especially after 1980, is much lower than for the black series. That group experiences only 30% growth from 1980 to 2014. Okay, so we think this type of result is important because the debate focuses a lot on how the economy is doing overall. That is, you hear a lot in the press, about the black numbers. But in reality, for the vast majority of the population, 90% in the US, the growth they will experience on average is really only half of the overall growth per adult. Now, if you go further down the distribution at the bottom, 50% adults on a pre-tax basis, there's essentially zero growth since 1980 on a pre-tax basis. And I remind you that this series aggregate to total national income. So here we do add the income components of the bottom 50%, like fringe benefits, health benefits that they might be entitled to. But even when you do that, you still find zero growth for the bottom 50%. On a post-tax basis, so here I repeat the bottom 50% pre-tax in red, and I show you the bottom 50% post-tax. They experience a 20% growth since 1980. So you can see that the government has compensated a little bit for the stagnation of their income, but 20% is still much, much less than the 60% that is experienced in growth per adult. Okay, so another way that has been used by labor economists to represent growth across the distribution is to have aligned people by income percentile, and then say at each percentile from 1980 to 2014 what has been the average growth. So careful here, this is not a longitudinal analysis. It's taking, the bottom, say the 20th percentile in 1980 and seeing, and looking at the bottom 20, the 20th percentile in 2014 and looking at their growth experience. So on average, the growth per adult is 1.4%. That's the horizontal line here. And what is striking is that you can see that for all groups up to the percentile 88, the growth per year is much less, is less than 1.4%. Actually, for a large chunk of the distribution is less than 1%. You really have to reach the high 88th percentile to experience the average growth that is discussed in the public debate. And then, of course, growth is much higher for the very top group. For the very extreme group at the top, the growth levels are comparable to what is experienced in China. Now, let me skip this one. So those series combine together all age groups. But what I want to point out next is that the stagnation of the bottom 50% is not at all an aging phenomenon, for the simple reason that our income definition is after the operation of the pension system. So we do impute income to the elderly. So for the all ages, you can see that from 79, to the present, it's essentially stagnation. But for the group 20 to 45 years old, it's actually a worse, an even worse, growth experience. And the 45 to 65 years old is also kind of stagnating. Actually, on a pre-tax basis, the elderly, because we count retirement income, are the groups is the group that does the best here for the bottom 50%. As you can see here, their average income, when you look at the bottom 50% among the 65 years old, has increased somewhat over that time period. Okay, so this is a graph that Lucas showed you, but I want to show it again to you to impress it in your minds, because I think it is an important graph. Oftentimes, when we were showing our series about the top 1% with Thomas, a lot of people were telling us, why should we care about the top 1%? They are such a small group, we should care about inequality at the bottom, etc. This graph shows you that what has happened at the top in magnitude, in terms of dollars, is actually huge. And so you can see that in the sense that the share of income going to the top 1% has grown from 10 to 20%, while the share of income going to the bottom 50% has gone down from 22 to 12. So you see it's the comparable magnitude, that is the gains accruing to the top 1% could in principle compensate fully for the losses that have been experienced by the bottom 50%. So I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but in terms of just the amounts, it squares up. What has been gained by the top 1% is what has been lost by the bottom 50%. Okay, so next I want to show you some results on gender inequality and its effects on individual level inequality. So the series that I have showed you so far for the top 10%, let's say, are the series here in green that shows you pre-tax income, in red here, pre-tax income per adult, splitting equally the income of married couples. What if instead of doing that, we're going to split income based on how it's earned within couples? So if, say, the wife in the 1950s doesn't work, she gets a 0, for labor income, and capital income is always split equally to reflect the fact that there is, in general, joint ownership of assets. In that case, we get the series in green. So in green, you have more income concentration because, particularly in the early period, because there is still a lot of gender inequality. That is, female spouses tend to earn less than their husband. So you give them a smaller amount and a bigger amount to the husband, and so you magnify inequality. But you can see that this gap has been reduced over time because the gender gap overall has been reduced. So if you want, in red, you have a really alarming story of how inequality has evolved. This has been compensated a little bit, by a happy story, which has been the reduction, the partial reduction in the gender gap. So let me show you a couple more graphs on that. So this is the ratio of pre-tax labor income of men to the average pre-tax labor income of women for the age group 20 to 64. So taking everybody, whether or not they work, but they are of a working age group, how much more the men make relative to the women. In the early 60s, the men were making, almost 4 times more. Today, we are down to 1.75 times more. So this combines everything: labor force participation, how many hours you work conditional on working, and as well as the wage rate effect. So you can see it is a significant reduction in the gender gap. So another way to look at it is to look at the share of women in various fractals of the labor income distribution. So share of women in the employed population has gone up from 38% now close to parity, something like 48%. Now, if you look at share of women in upper groups, say the top 10% of the labor income distribution, it was close to zero, actually 5%. There were only 5% of women in the top 10% in 1962, and that number has increased, mostly in the 80s and 90s, more slowly after 2000, and today we are at a number like 27%. So still pretty far from parity at 50%, but still, perhaps a closing of half of the gender gap. Now, if you look at groups further up, the increase has been more modest. So in the top 0.1%, there are still today only about 12% of women, in that top labor income group. So if you can see, if you can project that line at that slope, it's going to take a very long time to reach, the 50. It's going to be a very long march towards parity. So the bottom line here is that there are tons of studies on the gender gap in the US. With our data, we can look at it, on a comprehensive basis, and particularly focusing on the top. It's an important phenomenon that counteracts the overall increase in inequality, but certainly not enough per se, to alter, the big picture. So another one that I want to show, the last one I want to show you on gender. Here, we look at median pre-tax labor income for working age adults, working age women, and working age men. And we do see that phenomenon that's discussed a lot in the United States of stagnation of labor income for a large number of working age men, and in particular at the median. Already, you get zero growth. So further down the median, it's actually a decline. And contrast that with what has happened to working age women, where they had a good growth experience, at least up to 2000. After that, actually, the experience even for women has not been that good. And so those graphs are indeed very important in the current political context. That is, when a lot of angry voters were telling, reporters, etc., that they felt that they had lived through a decades-long recession. That makes sense when you look at those data. That is, for a lot of people, probably, their income growth experience on average, has been close to zero. Let me show you now a few results on decomposing inequality, labor versus capital. So, at the macro level, the share of capital income in national income in the United States has been, it's a fairly flat number, as is well known, when you learn basic macroeconomics, but it's not totally flat either. It's varied, from 30% in the early part of the 20th century down to something like low 20s in the post-World War II decades, and back up, perhaps now to a number like 30%. So capital income is slightly less than 1/3 of total income, but that share is much bigger for top income groups than for bottom income groups. So the bottom 90%, capital income is only perhaps 10 to 15%. And most of that actually comes from imputed rent of homeowners at the bottom and returns on pension funds. So it's not tangible, returns that they see, on their bank account. But for the top, capital income is much more important. Historically, it was very high at the very top. It's come down significantly since about the 1960s in the United States, and it seems like it has a low point at about 2000, and since then there is a little bit of comeback, of capital income in the top of the distribution. So perhaps a more, a more striking way to see this is if you look at the top 1% income share. So that number here, 19%, that's the top 1% income share in 1913, and so on. So it has that U shape. And now for each year, we decompose top 1% incomes into labor income in blue here and capital income in red. And so what you can see is that of the big rise in the top 1% income share from 10 to 20%, first, it looks like a labor income phenomenon where you can see the blue component here increasing sharply, but that increase stops around 2000. It's flat while the share of the red component keeps increasing sharply. So another final little fact on this is the...
Is it because labor is paid with capital?
Is labor... So here it's true that we have to make assumptions on what we call labor income and what we call capital income. And in particular for business income, is typically a mix of work. You work for your business and you receive, a return on the assets, on the building, the brand you've created, the business or the brand you've created. So we make assumptions here, so in the US case, an important component are stock options. Those are counted as labor income. Here, okay, and so because we think they are paid mostly, for compensation of labor income, but it's true. There are questions on whether, this demarcation, labor versus capital, reflected, in the data corresponds to the true economic concepts here. So another fact that shows you that something is changing is to look at the age composition of various groups by income. So the average age in the adult population has increased secularly over time, okay, from 43 to 47. If you look at the top of the distribution, they were much older in the 70s, but actually their average age was going down, which is consistent with the idea that at the top, labor income was becoming more important, so perhaps those were, on average, younger people, not retirees. However, after 2000, the age of the people at the top has started to increase sharply, as fast, if not faster than for the average population. So those age results are consistent with the view that at first the increase in income concentration in the United States was really new people, working rich people, executives making very high incomes and entering, those top income groups. After 2000, it seems that capital income is playing a bigger role. Perhaps those working rich have now retired and they are living off their accumulated fortunes. Perhaps some of them are leaving inheritances, to their kids, and their kids, they are older now, so they might, leave inheritances to their children later on. So possibly, yes.
What's the standard deviation on the top of 1%?
The standard deviation, I guess you can see it, from how each dot fluctuates from year to year.
Is the interval. Is this a population where within a standard deviation they're like 70 to 40, or it's a relatively tight range?
It's going to be
because people at 56 all work.
Yes.
So if they were plus or minus 1, they were very tight age round, then you would know it's just that they may have founded a firm around 1995 and they're still working, right? Or if it's a very wide distribution of average age, around the average very wide distribution, then you could have a lot more retirees.
Oh, I see. Yes. We haven't looked at the finer moments, of the distribution, but that's a good point. Okay, so the last aspect I want to discuss is the decomposition of inequality, looking at the role of taxes and transfers. So at the macro aggregate level, here you can see the rise of the government. So government was actually very small, taking in taxes less than 10% of national income when summing all levels of government. So you have a secular increase in the size of government up to 1980 and since, or 1970s, and since then the government has been taking about 30% of national income in taxes. So that overall picture is common to all advanced economies. So all advanced economies, have that pattern. The US stabilizes at a level that is relatively low, 30%. France would be something like 45% level. But you can still see that taking 30% of national income is going to make a big difference in the relative inequality, on a post-tax basis. Now, if you disaggregate by income groups, you can see that at first the rise of taxes, the rise of government was of government size, through more taxes, was done in a very progressive way, with the top 1% paying very high rates, 45% here, during World War II, relative to the bottom 50% that was paying, perhaps, 15% of their income in taxes. Since then, there has been a reduction in overall progressivity, in the sense that the tax rates for the top versus the bottom have largely converged, so that we've moved to a system where essentially taxes are proportional to income, with a little bit of progressivity, but not nearly as much as it existed in the decades, during and after World War II. And in particular, for the bottom 50%, the reason why they pay a lot more taxes, it's because there has been a large increase in payroll taxes, that is, Social Security contributions have increased dramatically. So now even the bottom 50%, pays a significant amount in taxes. For the top one, yes.
Why do you put Social Security contributions, since you're not treating them like that in your accounting framework?
So
they're not a tax in your accounting framework.
Yes. So the question I'm asked, so these payroll taxes include all Social Security contributions, including those funding pensions. While in my definition of pre-tax income, I subtract, the pension contributions and I add back Social Security contributions. So the reason we do that, it's because even though we think pre-tax income is the most meaningful to look at inequality, when you want to have a broad picture of what the government does, we want to include pensions. But it's true that you could redo those graphs, excluding the pensions as well.
Most of the increase is due to that.
Is due to, yes.
Otherwise, you're having it both ways.
Yes, no, I mean, yes, I agree that it's not fully consistent this way, but it's a way, of presenting, the overall government. And indeed, the rise of pensions is a big component, of the rise in the size of the government. So now, if you look at the top 1%, you can see that the system was progressive, mostly thanks to corporate taxes and individual income taxes. And the component that has fallen the most, actually, for the top 1% is the corporate tax component. So individual taxes still remain significant. So that's an interesting phenomenon in the United States. That is, even though, corporate profits have increased sharply, the corporate taxes collected on those profits has not increased that much relative to the share of GDP, and that reflects mostly tax avoidance, and mostly, you know, through multinationals that today can, to a large extent, avoid the corporate income tax by booking profits in low tax jurisdictions through tax minimization, legal tax avoidance, exploiting, you know, the weakness of the international system for corporate income taxes. Okay, so now these are taxes. What about spending? So you can see that here for spending, we are going to express funding as a percent of average national income. And so 50 years ago, individualized transfers in cash or in kind were very small, and they've increased a lot, while collective consumption expenditures has been roughly flat. So, and in the individualized transfers, you can then decompose how much each group is getting, again, as a percent of average national income, because remember that for transfers, they are roughly speaking flat per person. They don't depend very sharply on your level of income. So that's why the base to measure them should be the average national income in the economy. Okay? And so what we can see here is indeed that individualized transfers have, when we include social security here, have increased sharply, and they've increased sharply pretty much in the same way for all groups, perhaps the middle 40%, so that means the group above the bottom 50%, you know, is the one that has benefited the most from the increase in transfers, mostly, you know, Social Security and Medicare, which is health insurance for the elderly. The top 10%, you know, has also seen an increase, but the top 10% actually receives less in transfers, you know, per adult than the middle 40%. So here you can see why, you know, the system is still progressive, both on the tax side and on the transfer side. Okay, so let me skip this one, and let me finish with a comparison of the United States with France. So while we were working on the US case, a team here at PSE was working in the case of France, following pretty much the same methodology, so that we really would have numbers that would be comparable across the two countries. So I want to show you two charts. The first one is about the evolution of the top 10% income share in the US and France. So this is, again, you know, distributional national income, the share of total income, of total national income going to the top 10% adults, splitting equally incomes within couples on a pre-tax basis in the US in red and in blue in France. And so what you can see here is that France and the US look similar, you know, through the first part of the 20th century, but they diverge significantly after the 1970s, where you have a large increase in the US, while you have, you know, a much flatter line in the case of France, so that now, if you are an average top 10% adult, in the US, you really make 2.5 times more than in France. It's really 100K euros in France versus 250K euros in the US. Yes?
Do you know how much is immigration on that? Like if you write French financiers, you will go to London or New York.
So, the numbers on immigration that I've seen in the case of the United States and the UK are too small to make a big change in this picture. So in the red picture, if you were to exclude all non-US born people, you would get pretty much the same.
The rich Americans don't leave the US, but French.
Yes, no, but a lot of successful people, you know, come from elsewhere, like yourself, for example. You know, you've come to the United States. So Now, in the case of France, yes, we can't really know. You know, you could add people, you know, who have left France, you know, for London, and add them here, and perhaps, you know, you would get more of an increase. It's an interesting thing to do. It's rare to have countries that give you, you know, a breakdown, you know, by country of birth. Although in the case of France, I can say that a student of ours at Berkeley, you know, looked at the annuaire of École Polytechnique and could track, you know, how many were leaving France, you know, after, you know, 10 years after, etc. And it's true that those numbers have been increasing, you know, sharply. Even though, you know, as a base, it's still not, you know, a very large number of people who, a very large fraction of people who leave. Okay, so this is for the top. Now, if you look at the bottom 50%, here is what you get. So in France, so in the US, I've shown you the black chart here, where there is essentially stagnation of bottom 50% incomes per adult, while in France, actually, bottom 50% incomes have kept increasing. Even after the end of the 30 Glorieuses, there is still an increase here, so that strikingly, even on a pre-tax basis here, it's better to be a bottom 50% person. You're better off, you know, in terms of income in France than in the United States, even though the US has an average national income that is substantially, you know, something like 30% larger than the French one. But you should also note that the economic crisis here in Europe has been really terrible, and the incomes have stagnated, you know, pretty much for all groups, but in particular for the bottom 50% after 2007. So let me conclude. The DINA agenda is to construct new series on the distribution of pre- and post-tax income consistent with macro thought. So our hope is to develop prototypes in a number of countries that will inspire government agencies down the road to produce statistics that are broader, you know, than just national accounts. And indeed, I should say that there has been at OECD and various other organizations interest in doing distributional national accounts. In our view, with too little focus at the top, that they were more interested in breaking down growth by income quintile, which is useful, you know, to look at what happens at the bottom. But I think you need a lot more detail at the top, because the top 20% is a huge group in terms of the income share they get, particularly for capital income. For the United States, collapse of working age, bottom 50% pre-tax, that post-tax, you know, not compensated by the growth of transfers, boom of top-end inequality since the late 1990s seems to be due mostly to capital income, big gender gap at the top that has been shrinking but doesn't seem to shrink much anymore, and government has offset only a small fraction of the increase in pre-tax inequality due to a fall, you know, in tax progressivity over, you know, the last 5 or 6 decades, and still relatively limited transfers to the bottom 90%, bottom 50%. Thank you.
Excuse me. Did you make this paper available to you? For a copy of the paper? Did you make it available?
Oh yes, absolutely. The goal here is to provide not only paper but data, so that people. Yes. So the paper is posted online on our websites. The microdata, we hope, you know, within a couple months will also be online.
To give more detail on 50%, I agree, and you need to give us detail at the top.
Yes, so in principle, yes, we could disaggregate further the bottom 50%. We haven't done it in the paper because you realize that some people have zero, especially on a pre-tax basis. You do find zeros and even negative negative income, so how you treat those, you know, it's the results, if you look at the bottom 10%, are going, say, to be quite sensitive to exactly how you treat zeros, negatives. Okay, so that's why we haven't provided it. In some sense, you know, it's a lot easier. The top, it makes sense to disaggregate the top, you know, very much. Within the top 10%, it's a lot harder, you know, to further break down. Question over there.
So, with your method, are you able to know, for example, transform without education, higher education, secondary education? Are you able to know which group benefits the most from this table?
So I'm asked a question about education. How are the transfers for education taken into account, and how do we distribute them? So right now, we do the simplest possible assumption of assuming that they are distributionally neutral, which is not the correct assumption, because probably the rich, you know, benefit from better school. They are more likely to go, you know, to college, etc. So on this one, I think we have some sensitivity analysis, but I don't.
Why don't you allocate the per capita per student?
Because, you know, so sorry, let me not try to show you this, I'm going to confuse you. But, so right now, we have a very basic assumption that is not right. Doing better would require, you know, to do some work, right? To think through, you know, find data about how, you know, kids from different families benefit from the education system. And so that's an example where we hope, you know, there can be improvement. Remember, you know, I've called that a prototype because along many dimensions, it's still very rudimentary, but the hope is that if it takes off, you know, we will be able to improve. Thank you.
Thank you.